I want to talk a little about what craft is in the U.S., and this is a bit from the Craft Spirits Data Project, which is a collaboration between Park Street and our organization, ACSA. As of last year, there were nearly 2,300 active craft distilleries across the U.S. in every time zone. Since this measures only up until August 2021, that number's probably higher, probably around 2,500 at this point, and I think that's a pretty conservative estimate. But the next Craft Spirits Data Project's not ready yet, so we don't have those exact numbers. And now, of course, that raises a question of how do you define craft? Well, this is the definition that ACSA uses. Their distilleries, from a size perspective, they produce no more than 750,000 proof gallons that are removed from bond by a licensed producer. So, it's not in liters, so I guess triple or quadruple that, and you get in a sense what the liters are. They have to be a U.S. craft spirits producer, and they can't be majority controlled by a larger company. So it's okay for a large company to have invested in them as long as it's a minority stake. And, there are obviously some ethical and transparency things along that are in our code of ethics that people have to abide by. And that's mainly for membership in the association. But so basically you get an idea on the size and how independent they are. So in the last full years, and this is also from the Craft Spirits Data Project, in the last full year measured, craft spirits volume grew more than 7%, while revenue grew nearly 10%. And that's actually a slight deceleration from previous years, and that's owing mostly to COVID. The on-premise, as you know, was severely depressed, as was the business from distiller tasting rooms that were closed for the better part of 2020, well into 2021, and a lot of craft spirits producers depend on those, for a good chunk of their revenue. And now I want to look at some very specific spirits categories to get a sense how these are performing in the U.S. Of course, let's start with whiskey, which is obviously the most popular, and we'll start specifically with bourbon and rye. Bourbon still leads the American whiskey market. Many craft spirits producers got into the business because they wanted to make bourbon, and they've been pretty successful in helping change the misconception that bourbon's only supposed to be produced in Kentucky. I mean, most of the bourbon is produced in Kentucky, but it just has to be produced somewhere in the U.S. American rye volume, that's still just a fraction of what bourbon does, but it continues to grow very steadily in the double digits every year. The size of the market is something like 15 times that what it was just in around 2010. But again, it's still very, very small. But with new bourbon brands launching every day, it's getting much harder for a distillery to really break through with a bourbon brand. So, either they're, so it's good that rye is kind of catching on because that's a place where they can really make a differentiation. But also within bourbon, you're starting to see more experimentation, at least as much as the bourbon category definition will allow. As in order to be called bourbon, it's got to be at least 51% corn or maize and aged in new American oak. However, while you can't actually age bourbon in a previously used barrel, you can finish it in one after it's aged the requisite time in the new oak, so you can kind of play around on the finishing side. Sherry casks have been very popular here, just as they've been with Scotch whiskey. Another place where you're starting to see some innovation within bourbon is the use of some heirloom corn varieties, versus the widely available commodity grains, which typically were grown as animal feed. So people are, trying to find these older varieties of corn that have, far different character and, were sort of bred more culinary purposes than they were for livestock purposes. And some popular heirloom varieties. There's one called Bloody Butcher that's probably it's the most popular of those. Others have names like Boone County White, Hickory Cane, Missouri Shoepeg, Wapsie Valley, Hopi Blue, and there are hundreds of others. It's also happening on the rye side. You've got rye distilleries are starting to experiment to a much lesser extent, but they are starting to experiment with heirloom varieties of rye. There's a style out of Pennsylvania that was common over 100 years ago that was called Rosen, and that's built quite a following. It's having a little bit of a renaissance, very small one, but it's still having a little bit of a renaissance. There's another one out of Indiana that is called Balbo or Balboa. It looks like Balboa, but it's actually pronounced Balbo. In upstate New York, they've got a variety called Horton that there's a distiller there that's using. So, I think you're going to start to see a little more of that. Obviously, they're very, very hard to source, much lower yield than you would get with the commodity grains. But again, as the rye category grows, people are going to be looking to really distinguish themselves within that category. And I mentioned New York. One other thing about the state of New York. New York's distillers, they got together a few years back and they established a standard called Empire Rye. To qualify as Empire Rye, 75% of the whiskey's mash bill has to be New York grown rye, and the product itself must be mashed, fermented, distilled, barreled, and aged in the state as well. So, that's just one thing. Again, it's little pockets of innovation here and there in rye. But it's really exciting to see this sort of rye renaissance continue. After all, rye actually was the dominant grain used in America before America was even a country. And before distillers started migrating westward to what is now Kentucky, and then they started using the abundance of corn, the rest is history. They created bourbon. And now talk about American single malt whiskey. That's been surging quite a bit. It's definitely the fastest growing segment within U.S. whiskey. And that's great news because, as I mentioned, it's getting harder and harder to really break through in bourbon, so people have to look at other grains to really get a foothold in the market. The single malt segment's also very highly organized. About 6 years ago, the producers got together and created the American Single Malt Commission, and now that commission boasts something like 100 member distilleries. And American Single Malt's also a step closer to getting an official government definition. Just this past summer, the U.S. Alcohol, Tobacco, Tax and Trade Bureau, the TTB, they published a notice of proposed rulemaking that would add American single malt to the standards of identity for distilled spirits. That came after many years of petitions and comments from distillers and the Single Malt Commission. The TTB has proposed amending its regulations to include American single malt whiskey as a type of a whiskey that is a distinctive product of the United States. To be recognized as such under TTB's proposal, the product must be distilled entirely at one American distillery, and it must be mashed, distilled, and aged in the United States. It must also be sourced from a fermented mash of 100% malted barley, and it's got to come off the still at 160 proof and stored in oak barrels that are no bigger than 700 liters. But it's not at the finish line yet, not quite. TTB has solicited comments on the proposal from distillers, and it's still in the process of reviewing those comments. A few weeks back, my organization, ACSA and Discus, we had a joint public policy conference. We had some TTB officials there. Of course, burning question on a lot of people's minds was, what's the timeline for the official definition of TTB? And they were very, very hesitant to give us a timeline. So I'm hoping in the next few months. Let's jump out of vodka and into gin. You heard a little bit about gin, what's going on here, but let's talk a little about what's happening in the U.S. As you can see on the show floor here, You really can't walk anywhere without bumping into a gin brand. Gin reconquered Europe and much of the world, and it's also having something of a renaissance in the U.S., but, not quite to the same extent, and there are a few headwinds in its way. If you look at overall growth numbers, of the gin category in the United States, it's typically year on year flat to slightly down about 1.5%. But if you look deeper, into the different price segments, you look at the above premium price segments, they're typically up in the double digits. And if you go even higher into the highest of the high, like the super premium price brands, they're growing by triple digits. And that's really in the above premium where the craft gins play. So, on the craft side, gin's really growing, but if you look at the overall category, which is still dominated by very, very large brands, it looks like it's down. And there's a lot of innovation happening in American gins. Distillers are experimenting with new botanicals that hadn't been used before. They're using different kinds of tea leaves. Honey is another one that people are using. Ocean kelp, basil, and then some are using, flowers that can naturally change the color of the spirit. Specifically, Durham Distillery out of North Carolina, they just launched a gin that does that. They infuse butterfly pea flowers, which help change the color. So it's like a purple color. And also beyond that sort of thing, and as you've seen here too, barrel-aged gins, they're catching on in the U.S., they're gaining popularity. And I'm also noticing that initially when you would get a mature gin, quote-unquote mature one that's been barreled, you'd see it was like 2-3 months it was spending in the barrel. And you're still seeing a lot of that, but you're actually starting to see some people letting it barrel rest for upwards of 6 months, and I've seen some over a year, even 2 years. So you're starting to get into like whiskey aging territory at that point. Now, there's always been this debate whether the notion of terroir exists within spirits. There are very strong opinions on both sides when it comes to whiskey. It's really hard to argue against its presence in gin because distillers, they're incorporating botanicals that are unique to their regions to give their gins a bit of a local flavor, something that helps them, again, create that point of differentiation. But again, these are still a niche within a niche because gin still faces a lot of obstacles, preventing it from getting the kind of attention that whiskey or agave spirits have been getting from the American public. First, there's a bit of a knowledge gap. Craft cocktail bartenders, they'll fully embrace it and mix it in some very interesting cocktails. But if you look at the off-premise, there's a bit of a knowledge gap. They're still behind. They're still setting the shelf sets for the gin and tonic drinker. Not that there's anything wrong with a gin and tonic. I love gin and tonics. It's always my go-to. But if you look at some of the things that happen at the height of the pandemic, people did a lot more home bartending. They were learning more of their own DIY mixology. So consumers are starting to catch up what's happening in the bars. The retailers are sort of lagging behind, and they seem to be giving more space to the tequila and mezcal category, and they're taking some of that from the gin category. So you really need to up the education, especially on the off-premise side, because gin is definitely growing on-premise, but it's been lagging off-premise. Not to mention there are also misconceptions that consumers still have about what gin's supposed to taste like, or they had a really bad experience as a young drinker, what they call gincidents, so they think, oh, that stuff tastes like trees and it made me really sick. And there weren't a lot of options back then, but now they've exploded. So, hopefully we'll get past some of those headwinds and really see a true gin renaissance in the U.S. A little bit about vodka. obviously, I can't not talk about it because it is the largest category by volume. Whiskey is the biggest category by revenue. That's because of higher price points, but vodka still hands down commands the most volume. It's not always the most exciting spirit to the craft crowd because by definition it wasn't supposed to taste like anything. Until about 2 years ago, the TTB defined vodka as, quote, neutral spirits distilled or treated after distillation with charcoal or other materials so as to be without distinctive character, aroma, taste, or color. They've since moved away from the whole without distinct flavor and character qualifier, which means that as long as a spirit is coming off the still at least 190 proof, 95% alcohol, there can be as much character as that remaining 5% that's not ethanol will allow it to have. But that wasn't really anything new for a lot of American craft distillers who were already making really good vodkas, very distinctive vodkas. And these aren't just people producing it like we need something for cash flow while we're waiting for our whiskey to age. They truly believe in the category and the diversity that can exist within it. Let's say, for instance, there are distilleries making vodka out of unused wine grapes, and that vodka is going to be considerably different than one made from rye, which is going to be different from one made from wheat, and they're all going to be very different from one that's made from honey, which is also happening. So, while you look at supposed luxury brands of vodka that tout being pure and 10, 20 times distilled, many craft producers are distilling it far fewer times as possible. Some are distilling it only twice because they really want to retain as much of the character of that base substrate as they can. So don't sleep on American vodka. Exciting things can and will happen. And I want to save the biggest growth story, not the biggest category, but the biggest growth story for last. And that, of course, is ready-to-drink cocktails. And I'm talking about actual cocktails, ones that have an actual spirit base, not a malt or wine base. Last year, spirit-based RTD volume was up 53%, according to IWSR. And while simple mixed drinks like vodka, sodas, gin and tonics, etc., they tend to be the most common in this space, you're starting to see more complex craft cocktail-inspired RTDs that could be canned old fashions, gin basil smashes, tiki drinks like Mai Tais and Three Dots and a Dashes, for instance. So, there are some challenges despite that rapid growth. There's an issue of tax parity. You've got 50 different states, which means 50 different sets of laws. And because they're spirit-based, most states are taxing them at a higher rate than they would a malt-based RTD, even though those malt-based RTDs might have the same ABV or one that's even higher than the spirits one. And the industry's been working to change that, but it's a process. Again, 50 states, 50 laws. Another significant barrier to entry is retail access. A lot of states, spirit-based RTDs aren't able to get into the venues where spirits are typically prohibited. And some sectors of the beer industry are fighting to keep it that way. Beer likes things the way they are, and they like that malts, they have their own hard seltzers made from malt that they want to keep selling. And then beyond that, there are also some quality control, shelf stability issues. You've got a lot of fresh ingredients that have to be stabilized on the shelf, and they're still figuring out how to do that. But there have been some positive developments, at least on the legislative front. Last year, Michigan and Nebraska lowered their excise taxes on low-alcohol RTDs, and there's even been some progress in states where spirits are sold only in state-owned stores. While most of those control states are still requiring them to be sold in their stores, a few of them are allowing lower ABV RTDs that are spirit-based to be sold in grocery stores, and that's recently happened in Idaho, Mississippi, and Virginia. And I will leave you with that. Thank you so much. That's how you can contact me.